listening to The Weather Junkies.
Oh boy. Large wedge tornado coming into Tuscaloosa. A winter storm warning is in effect for our area.
The snow is expected at least another 2 to 4 inches overnight. Then that snow's
The National Weather Service in Huntsville has issued a tornado warning for northwestern Massachusetts.
14 to 22 inches of snow!
All right, good evening. Welcome to the Weather Junkies. I'm Tyler Jankowski, joining the show as always from Connecticut, my home state, alongside Dakota Smith in Colorado. Dakota?
Hey, Tyler. Out in Colorado today. Thanks for joining us tonight. You know, it's been really nice out here. We've been sitting under this ridge, and it's gotten up to the 60s, I think, for the past few days. And we've had a few minor wind events with downslope winds. So, you know, overall, it's pretty good weather out here, and I really can't complain. Although, you know, I'm a snow guy. I can't complain about the nice weather right now. How is it out in Connecticut?
It's cold. We're in a short-lived cold spell, but convening every week and talking about the weather in two very different locations is actually kind of neat because, as we like to say, the weather moves from west to east, generally speaking, and you're saying it's warm and comfortable out there. That's exactly what we're expecting next week. So your weather foreshadows what we have in several days.
Yeah, and the ridge out here is supposed to break down, and we're actually supposed to get into kind of a different pattern. And, you know, that actually leads us right into our first tweet of the night. It's from Weather 5280. They're a weather group out here, similar to the Capital Weather Gang, but they focus on the Front Range of Colorado. And their tweet is a return to a more active storm track for March. And they link to their blog where they write. It's a great write-up about some of the teleconnections and what previous El Nino years have meant for Colorado in terms of snow. And March is one of the snowiest. Actually, it's the snowiest month of the year out here.
Wow.
And it looks like we're gonna usually during these El Nino years we'll have a big storm. We had a big storm in January, but the teleconnections and some of the medium range models, it looks like it's going to become stormy again out here. And we really need that for our snowpack because that plays a big role in terms of the drought and fire conditions in the summer.
Oh, you know, that's interesting. I have been seeing some stuff about Northern California, about the El Nino finally living up to its name.
Right.
And a deluge in Northern California, many, many inches of rain expected. And for us, it's not the case, though, next week. It does look like a solid stretch of warmth, 70-degree temperatures, but not a whole lot of rain through the middle part of the week. So it'll be exciting. First 70-degree weather so far this year. Believe it or not, we didn't have a 70-degree day in January or February, despite the fact that this winter has been crazy warm, or odd, I should say, so far. We're going to come in with one of the least snowiest winters, top 10 finish, I think. I think we're at like 7 or 8 least snowy right now. And there's no snow in sight, so we could very well end up in the top 10 least.
Yeah, on that note, one of our scientists out here, I think it's a grad student, sends an email to everyone every week every month, with the climate stats for that month. And in this email, in this write-up, I guess, it was the 5th warmest February. And we had 0 days sub-zero. That's only the 5th time that's ever happened in the month of February. And it was the 14th warmest winter, so December, January, February. And it was the 6th snowiest December, January, February. And, you know, it's weird. It was one of our wetter Februaries that we've ever had, but we only had like one storm that brought precipitation. And it goes to show you how dry our Februaries are normally, and how much precip that we got during that big storm earlier in February. So that's a few quick facts about it out here. It's been a weird winter, to say the least, out here.
Connecticut has 2 climate sites, Bridgeport area and the Hartford area. In both climate sites, tied for the warmest winter on record December, January, and February. You do have to use the averaging by days method in order to come up with that. It appears that the National Weather Service averages just a handful of numbers, the monthly numbers, and that would get you a number 2 finish. But if you do use the perhaps more logical method of averaging, I think it's like 91 days we calculated, we tied for the warmest winter on record in Connecticut, both sites. So impressive.
Wow. So let's go into our next tweet. And this tweet comes from Dr. Marshall Shepard, a previous guest on the show. And this is also a link to a write-up that he had. He had it on Forbes. And the tweet says, as we enter March to May, good disk move over snow days is the era of tornado days for school systems. And that's a really interesting point. You know, we're very used to snow days and that concept. But it seems like more and more schools are letting out for a forecast of severe weather. And Tyler, I'm curious what you think about that.
This is an intriguing tweet. I'm glad you chose it. You know, this is something that we've seen pop up now and then, either people loving it or bashing it online. It probably is something new because in the past we haven't been able to forecast tornadoes with the accuracy that we have now. I think this is a brilliant idea. And I love the idea of closing school for a day if you're in a moderate or in a high risk. I think it's a no-brainer to close school for something like that. I think it makes perfect sense. You know, there's no guarantee that you get hit by a tornado or a severe storm, but if you're in a moderate or a high risk, there's a good chance that there's going to be severe weather pretty close to where you are. So I think it's a great idea. And I agree with the headline there, move over snow day, because in many cases, severe weather is a heck of a lot more life-threatening than snow.
Yeah, you know, I agree. And I was listening to the Weather Brains and they talked about this for quite a bit. And they made a good point that in some districts, it makes sense. But in other districts, for instance, maybe a place where the majority of students live in mobile homes, it really doesn't make sense because they'd actually be less safe in their home compared to the school. And, you know, it also brings up a whole, you know, if one tornado hits a school, then you have all those people in that one place compared to a tornado going through, you know, one small community and only hitting a few places where people are living. So it's a really, I think it's a very complex issue. It's not as cut and dry as snow days, where the implications of travel are much easier to kind of take in compared to severe weather. So I
can see that point. You know, I don't know how many parents would agree with being separated from their kids in a tornado,
yeah,
but
right.
I could see that point.
Yeah, he asked for comments from parents to see what they think, and I'd be intrigued on what they think. I'm sure there's some social science there to be looked into. Speaking of social and communication sciences, tonight we have a very special guest, Adam Rainear from the University of Connecticut. He's a grad student in the communications program, and he has a degree in meteorology and political science or journalism, from Rutgers. And we actually pre-recorded this interview on yesterday, and I think we can just go ahead and start with that. And we'd like to welcome to the show Adam Rainear. He's a graduate student at the University of Connecticut in the communications department, and he has a meteorology degree and journalism degree from Rutgers. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I saw your presentation at AMS, and it was kind of like my go-to presentation. I think for a lot of people it was. And so I wanted to kind of go into the stuff you presented into a little more detail. To start, well, this show will be about, you know, naming winter storms. But just to start, at AMS you said that 2/3 of people who use social media use it for news. And that's huge, right? Specifically for TV meteorologists or TV broadcasters in general. And, you know, as Tyler can attest, TV meteorologists and reporters have embraced social media. But what kind of shift do you see happening now or in the future when it comes to where people get their weather, and what could that mean for broadcast meteorologists?
It's really interesting because you would think, at least maybe a couple of years ago, that maybe apps and weather apps would take over because you could just punch in your zip code or your town name and just like the weather.gov homepage and find all of the information you need immediately. But now kind of people are passively getting their weather, I guess I would say, whether it be from their Facebook feed or their Twitter news feed or something like that. And they're not necessarily having to seek out the information. They're kind of just like accidentally stumbling upon it and finding it. And I mean, in most cases, since weather is such a really small field, it gets lumped in with news generally. But you know, you see it, I'm sure you both see it on your own personal timelines or news feeds, how many news articles get shared either by friends or just by the news organizations or the journalists themselves. And it's a significant shift. People aren't really spending as much time watching the 5 o'clock or the 6 o'clock news or the Weather Channel. They can get the information so much quicker or in such a more natural way just by scrolling through their news feed or in their timeline or something like that. So it's really interesting.
Your point about the passive consumption of weather information is very interesting because I think even as a meteorologist who forecasts the weather, that is also true on a little bit more of a complex level. Mm-hmm. You know, we wake up in the morning, we look at our Twitter feed, or even when we're eating, we're still looking at Twitter or Facebook. I mean, there's almost nothing that can get past you if you're an avid Twitter user, especially, or if you're an avid Facebook user. And so as the person who actually communicates the weather and makes the forecast, it's easier not to miss things by passively paying attention to what's going on. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that you brought that up because I think it's definitely true for us and as you say, true for the end user. I mean, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about that, but I would say it's probably a little bit concerning in some ways because if you're passively consuming it, you're probably not getting all the details.
Yeah, and I think really social media has kind of changed the whole field of communication. And you know, we kind of saw you know, we used to watch TV in a more passive manner, but nowadays it's almost half passive, half active because you are watching TV and then tweeting about your favorite TV show or commenting about the weather forecast using some hashtag or something like that. So it's almost like this mix of the two. But yeah, to go back to the point you said about, you know, meteorologists passively consuming the weather, we're just so invested in it and ingrained in it naturally that our natural news feeds or our usual everyday news feeds are just so weather that's kind of just the news to us, and we're just heavily ingrained in it and almost, you know, never putting it to rest and never fully removing yourself from the weather forecast or what's going on in the weather world and that whole kind of ordeal. So it is really interesting, and it's created a lot of new research opportunities, I would say, for sure. But it also throws some wrenches into what you kind of knew about the field of communication and weather communication and things like that before, you know, we really had social media, or at least before social media took off. So, you know, the whole news landscape is really changing, but I think social media has had one of the largest impacts on it for sure.
Do you think for the better, or is that not that easy of a question to answer?
I would probably say I go back and forth on this question. I think the timeliness that social media affords makes it for the better. Being able to communicate during disasters and crises and things like Hurricane Sandy and stuff like that. If your power hasn't gone out or if you haven't lost cell service yet, you know, you can call and text your neighbors. You can post on their wall. You can use Messenger or whatever you need to use to get in touch and make sure everybody's okay. But at the same time, there's so much, I don't want to call it poor journalism, but you see a lot of these amateur, non-professional Facebook accounts taking the lead in forecasting, and people are really investing their effort into finding the forecast with these people. And these people may or may not have a meteorology degree. They may or may not have even graduated from high school yet. So I think it forces people to become more literate and media literate, if you will, more active in selecting maybe where they get their information from, because I think most of us would agree that the high schooler who hasn't graduated yet probably shouldn't be forecasting or attempting to communicate a forecast. Maybe they take a forecast from a reputable source and then communicate it to another audience, and that's beneficial. But if they're trying to create their own weather forecast and do it their own way without having the dynamics and the thermodynamics and the synoptic forecasting and the meso forecasting and all of that, it really probably does a disservice to our field. And it's unfortunate because it seems like these profiles are the ones that have the most likes and the most follows. I know there's some where I'm from that are extremely popular just compared to the local meteorologists on the news. So it may do us both positives and negatives, I guess you could say. But I would hope that in the end, the positives outweigh the negatives for sure.
Yeah, I feel like at least once a show we end up talking about weather enthusiasts and the Facebook groups or Facebook pages that they have. So it's clearly an important issue right now in our field.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to get into your research. For people who weren't at AMS or didn't see the presentation, I was wondering if you could give like a minute or so summary of some of the things you found when it comes to naming winter storms.
Yeah, so right after the storm names kind of came out, I personally became really interested in wondering whether or not they would work. And once I got to grad school, I was able to test. So I really studied it from a hazard and outrage standpoint and a source credibility standpoint. So hazard and outrage are essentially what the word suggests that they are. How outraged are you by some weather event happening, and how hazardous do you see the weather event being? And then source credibility really refers to how credible do you find the source who would be disseminating the weather information. So in this instance, it would be the Weather Channel. So we analyzed that using an experiment. It was a student sample. We had about 407 participants, and we created some mock tweets. So the tweets were based off of an actual Weather Channel winter storm tweet from last winter. And I just kind of went in and HTML coded some of the changes and made a fictitious snowstorm, essentially. And then I gave one a European name, which was Bill. I gave one of the Weather Channel names from, I believe, last season, which was Zealous. And then our control condition didn't have a name. And then we compared the three conditions on those variables I mentioned before, the hazard, the outrage, and the source credibility. And we really didn't find a lot of differences. Going into the study, one might anticipate that the name Bill would be more acceptable to a European eyes and American citizens, essentially, and people who are familiar with the name Bill. And Zealous might have some pushback, and people might not take it seriously or find it credible. Or be willing to change some behavior or something like that based off the name. And we really didn't find that, neither for the control. So even when the storms aren't necessarily named, the results didn't differ a whole lot. So it was kind of tricky going into the study, since there obviously isn't a lot of research in this area, as to whether we should hypothesize how the results might go in some directional format, or if we should just leave them open as like an exploratory research question and then investigate and see where the results end up. But for the hazard, the outrage, and the source credibility, we really found no significant differences across either of the names. So that's promising, I guess you could say, for naming winter storms. But I mean, this was a very early exploratory study, and it was a student sample, so it would be useful to redo the study with a more generalizable sample, maybe some people who, some demographics that match up with the Weather Channel viewership or their Twitter demographics or something like that, just to see if the results generalize. But one of the most interesting things that emerged, I think after Winter Storm Nemo, we obviously all saw the memes and the humorous tweets and things that came out of it, and the images and things like that. And one could probably assume that college students would be the ones, or younger populations would be the ones, to make those memes and those funny tweets and be humorous about the winter storm named Nemo. And what we found is they really didn't find any humor or anything trivial with the name Zealous. So all of the indications that, the Weather Channel storm names are funky and funny, and they're so strange that people might have some pushback towards them, that really didn't hold up here. And it didn't hold up for the younger sample, and we didn't find people finding the tweets humorous or non-believable or anything like that. So I think that is one of the more significant findings of this study, and I think that's something that we should continue to explore, because if people aren't finding the name, having no issue with these mythologically based or Greek-based names, then maybe this is a method that we continue using, and maybe the Weather Channel's idea of trying to separate hurricane names from winter storm names actually does hold some weight, has some credence. So I think that was one of the more interesting findings for sure.
So since you've been in Connecticut for a little bit, you probably have noticed that there's a local station here that also names winter storms.
Yes.
And they've done it for at least 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
I could say decades, and that would be accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And they continue to name winter storms despite the fact that the Weather Channel now names storms. So every time there's a storm, and I don't really get into this, I couldn't tell you the storms we've had this winter. I just don't pay attention to names. But there's two names for each storm, and it's like an ongoing joke here in Connecticut. What are we going to call it? What would you say about that?
I think, to be honest, it does a little bit of a disservice to the community. Now, that's not wholly true, because there have been some research studies that have proven that localized hashtags and things like that on Twitter actually serve more useful than a broader regional hashtag, we'll call it. So like a hashtag that emerges for southwestern Connecticut or the western half of Connecticut or something like that might be more useful for those residents than if the Weather Channel were to put out a hashtag for a storm that was going to affect all of New England, the blizzard of New England or whatever. So it's kind of back and forth. I think it would be extremely confusing and a real disservice if everybody, came up with their own list of names and were tweeting or coming up with names and naming storms for their area while the Weather Channel was doing them on a more national scale, because we just have such a large body of names. And I hate to be the one that says, well, they only do this for with one small area, whereas the Weather Channel does it nationally, so the Weather Channel should hold more weight, because I don't think that's necessarily fair either. But at the same time, I think it would be worth reconsidering the practice if the Weather Channel names prove to be accepted widely. And I think the past couple of winters have kind of showed that they do generate an extremely large amount of buzz on Twitter, and I would imagine they do the same on Facebook. Media outlets aren't really too reluctant to pick up on the storm names if they don't have some competing interest with the Weather Channel or the Weather Channel's parent organization. But I think you have to kind of stay along this fine line of, do we really want to have a bunch of individualized named hashtags for this one winter storm just so people can search for their area? Or do we have to rely on people being able to search a national hashtag and then tailor the information to their area? Again, going back to that kind of media literacy or weather literacy I talked about earlier. So it's back and forth. I don't want to say it's positive or negative, but I think it certainly can get confusing, and it's something I wanted to make a note of. I believe there's another station in Wisconsin or Minnesota or something like that that also names storms and has named storms for a really long time. So I'm sure there are a few outlets across the country that do it, but if it ever went to an accepted government practice similar to the hurricane names, I would hope that these organizations would realize it's probably, time to stop. And we had a good idea, and maybe we were the first ones to do it, but somebody else took the lead nationally, and it's time to just do the community a service rather than a disservice.
So do you think that's how it would happen? Like the National Weather Service be like, hey, we're going to start naming storms now, and the Weather Channel would have to back off of that?
That's, I believe, from the communications that I've had with some people at the Weather Channel, that was their original intention, was to pilot this essentially and then kind of pass along the buck to the it probably wouldn't be the Weather Service. It would probably be the WPC or something like similar to how we issue moderate risks and things like that by the SPC, because there would be so much winter storms kind of cross so many lines with the forecast offices that you really couldn't rely on the forecast offices to issue the name. It would have to be some larger national entity, and the WPC would probably be the best center to do that. But I think when it originally started, the Weather Channel hoped to just pilot it because they're more successfully off financially than the government is, and the government probably can't pilot and afford to spend all this money and resources on testing these winter storm names and things like that, especially if it proved to fail. I mean, to start, no one really knew if it was going to be successful or not. I mean, you can have your hunches and you can argue that it would catch on Twitter and have some reach and things like that. But if it doesn't extend beyond Twitter, maybe it really isn't all that useful, because something like, I don't know, 15 or 20% of internet users use Twitter. So that's not even that much of, or that large of a segment. So is it really worth it in that sense? So it would have to be some national entity. My guess would be the WPC, but it would have to work in a similar fashion to how the SPC kind of does mod risks and high risks and things like that, and then relay the local information to the forecast offices and allow them to communicate the local impacts a little bit further.
So the whole piloting thing is interesting to me, because the narrative I've kind of heard from certain people in our field, in our community, is that there was some kind of tension between the National Weather Service and the Weather Channel, because the Weather Channel never approached anyone to talk about it, or to, like, I don't know, weigh their options. Obviously, I have no idea what actually happened, but that was kind of the narrative I had. So I think it's really interesting that, you know, the Weather Channel's perspective, they were trying to do good in the community, not just, you know, as everyone thinks, just for ratings. So I don't know. That's a completely different perspective than I heard before, and it makes me kind of, I don't know, like their motives better.
Yeah, I've heard both sides of the story, to be honest with you. But I included a quote in my paper early on in the process. I think it was 2012 or 2013. They interviewed the National Weather Service, and the Weather Service said that they refrained from acknowledging winter storm names because a winter storm's impact can vary from one location to another, and storms can weaken and redevelop, making it difficult to define where one ends and another begins. Excuse me. So I could see how both sides might feel one way or the other, and maybe in the end, the Weather Service really doesn't have any interest in adopting this, and either stays with the Weather Channel or it dies. But I think as a whole, the field as a whole, it really does a disservice if we continue to, you know, perform this method, but we don't ever analyze, is it working, or should it be more widely adopted, or things like that. I mean, we're a field on, we find out that things do work or don't work essentially by how well our forecast works and how well we communicate our forecast, and essentially how many lives are or are not lost. And I think if we are doing a disservice to our community by naming winter storms one way or the other, or not naming winter storms, I think we should know that and be able to quantify it with research, rather than this whole back and forth between two entities that may or may not like each other, and just leaving it there rather than ever actually testing it and going further and beyond it. So yeah, I totally understand both sides of the story, and I can understand both arguments. I can understand how people might think it's a marketing ploy, it's just trying to generate buzz and things like that. But at the same time, I mean, hashtags have proved immensely successful. People now hashtag on Facebook and Instagram, and really there is no purpose to hashtag on Facebook or Instagram, or at least there wasn't when Twitter developed the hashtag and the idea first started. So it's really become a universally accepted thing in social media and communication as a field. So if it's going to work and it redirects you to more information about Winter Storm Bill or Winter Storm Zealous or whatever by clicking on that hashtag in the Twitter interface or something like that, then I think it's really something we need to analyze and look at further for sure.
Initially, when the Weather Channel came out with the names, I don't know how long it's been, what, 4 years maybe?
Yeah, I think it's about 4 years, yeah.
I was, like a lot of people, very much opposed to the names. And I have a lot of respect for Tom Nizzle. I heard him speak in person personally about the storm names at AMS a couple years back, and his reasoning was very very reasonable. It made sense, and you know, I trusted what he was saying. But I almost don't care what anyone says. I really do think that the Weather Channel came up with the names as a marketing ploy, and even if it does help, and even if they say it helps, they created the naming system at a time when their website was rapidly exploding into something much different than it was in the past. they started posting how to cure the common cold, or watch this car go off a bridge and smash through a lake. I mean, not weather. So this naming coincided with a major expansion of the website, not necessarily all good. So I really do think they figured, oh, look we can create some buzz on social media. We'll be the ones that come up with it. We'll be the ones that get credit. Weather Channel, Weather Channel, Weather Channel. I think that was said in some of the meetings that they had. Pure speculation, but that's my analysis of the situation. With that being said, that's why I really think it needs to transfer to an official source, a government source, just like hurricane names, because it turns my stomach over when I hear someone that doesn't work for the Weather Channel use the name, especially when they're also in the media business trying to make money. I mean, it doesn't feel right.
I wouldn't disagree with that. Now, in the same token, it's much easier for you being the Weather Channel or whoever is in charge of running this, to quantify how successful their hashtag is if the name isn't something like Bill or Andrew or typical common European hurricane names that are going to appear in a large variety of tweets that have nothing to do with weather. It would just be so much information you need to cycle through every time somebody hashtagged Bill or Andrew or whatever. Whereas it's probably much easier to comb through hashtag Zealous and hashtag Nemo and hashtag YOLO. Maybe not hashtag YOLO today, but you get my point. Like these unique names, if you will, make it a little easier to understand whether or not the system works. And I know that they wanted them to be different from the hurricane names. Now, how different may be the center of an argument, and maybe this is too different. But at the same time, I mean, they do hold some weight somewhere. It's not like they just put together letters of the alphabet and put them on a list and said, all right, these are going to be our winter storm names. They do hold some mythological credibility. And I know now they're working with a school in, I believe, Montana that provides the list or suggestions for the list every year. And then some employees at the Weather Channel kind of comb through and adjust the list on how they think it's appropriate, or if a name will work, or if it's not going to work, or if it's too short or too long or something like that. So I don't think I disagree with you in any sense, but I think marketing ploy or marketing gig or something like that is a little bit extreme, a little strong of a statement, though. I mean, I've heard that argument, I can't tell you how many times, countless and countless and countless times. But at the same time, they do make a fair point that if you tried to measure how successful hashtag Winter Storm Bill was, it would be extremely hard to comb through all the data, because people probably tweet about Bill or somebody named Bill or the dollar bill or the word bill so frequently that you would probably never be able to get meaningful data out of it. So I get both sides of the argument, and I try and stay objective because I'm doing research on this and I want to stay objective, but at the same time, I can understand why they wanted their names to be at least somewhat unique for the pilot part of this and their initial phase of naming storms, and then how they transition from here forward is a different argument and a different story for sure.
So changing gears a little bit, I'm from the East Coast, and I know that a big winter storm shuts down all the cities. Whatever in cities are going to impact, they're shutting them down, especially Philly and southward.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. Would naming a winter storm change actually how the public views one of these big winter storms, or do you have any inclination to know whether naming a storm that maybe is less severe, that's not like one of these big nor'easters, would actually be more beneficial than naming? Obviously, you'd have to name all of them, but the net gain from the more awareness. Do you think? How do you think it's different between big storms or smaller storms or anything in between?
I think that's a fair point, and I think we as meteorologists struggle with that immensely, especially people in the forecasting business, because 2 inches of snow in Atlanta means something totally different than 2 inches of snow in Boston, and then you're not even accounting for the fact that maybe that snow will come during rush hour, maybe they'll come overnight, maybe there'll be 1/10 of an inch of ice glaze on top of it, maybe there'll be an inch ice glaze on top of it. I mean, I think we get so caught up in forecasting totals and amounts and things like that we really don't pay a lot of attention to forecasting the impact of the storm and the timing and things like that, how does the storm really impact the day-to-day life? Because, I mean, that's essentially what we're doing. I mean, it's cool to get a record-breaking snowstorm, but to the average person, what's the difference between 20 inches and 30 inches? Even some people, what's the difference between 10 inches and 30 inches? A snowstorm is a snowstorm to a lot of people. They take the day off from work, they go out and they shovel, and then the next day things are pretty much clean except for the extreme cases, and they go back to work. So I think as a field, we really have to focus on communicating the risks a little better. And I mean, uncertainty makes that so difficult. Obviously, the model runs change that. From run to run, you can have one run saying, "Oh, it looks like we're going to get buried by a blizzard," and then the next run is out to sea, and you just communicated to however many viewers that we're going to get buried by a blizzard. So it's a fine line. I don't know that naming a storm would necessarily cause somebody to take it more seriously, especially because most people's impressions of storm names are probably going to be preconceived notions about the hurricane naming system. And once a hurricane is named or a tropical system is named, people start to take it seriously. But before that, usually people don't take it seriously. So I think that a lot of that would probably translate, since those are the preconceived notions that people have about, how we name weather events and things like that, that once it got a name, everybody might go into panic mode and buy the bread and the milk and start freaking out. And maybe that's not necessarily the best thing, especially if you're on the edge of the storm or the fringe area or the cutoff line or the rain snow line. Your impacts just might not be that severe. So it's a very good question and a very good point, but I think people would probably rely to the mechanisms they developed for hurricane names and how we name hurricanes, because that's what most people are familiar with, and that's probably, that is the most widely accepted and used naming strategy we have in the weather field. So that would be what my guess was, but that's pretty much pure speculation.
Dakota and I pretty much agree that we like the criteria that the Weather Channel uses to name storms, but we don't think it's perfect. It's not easy. With a hurricane, it's much easier because you're using a scientific method, wind speeds, and we are talking about the potential of someone else naming the storms. If the National Weather Service were to take it over, the Weather Prediction Center, what do you think would be the best criteria or way to name winter storms?
I don't know that there's another way really to do it than the way the Weather Channel does it, to be honest with you. I think you obviously have to take in population impacted. Now, maybe you could come up with some kind of formula that determines how severely the population will be impacted, instead of just 40 million people will be impacted, but not everybody will be impacted equally, kind of thing. But I think that's definitely an important consideration when doing this. And the other thing, they use the Weather Channel warnings and watches, which, as we know, vary depending on the location. So they are taking into account the difference between 2 inches of snow in Boston versus 2 inches of snow in Atlanta, because those would trigger different warnings, watches, and advisories, because they're two different areas, two different cities that are familiar with different weather events. So I think the way they do it now is probably the best / most convenient way. But if you wanted to tinker with it, I think coming up with some way to categorize how the population will be affected. So maybe 20 million people will be stranded at home, and they will be affected by the most severe, thunder snow and the heaviest snowfall rates, or ice, or something like that. And then the other 20 or 10 million people here or 10 million people there will be affected less intensely, and maybe the storm won't be as strong for them, and maybe they'll lose a day of school, but they're probably not necessarily risking their lives. There won't be a state of emergency if they go out and travel, that kind of thing. So I think maybe a little bit of a tinkering with the impact tool that the Weather Channel uses. But I mean, to be honest, I don't know what else you could really do, because like everybody admits, snowstorms are so different depending on where you are, and they develop so differently. And you really end up having to nowcast a lot of times for parts of the snowstorms anyway, for different areas, depending on dry slots and things like that can really throw off totals and the impacts for a certain area. So I would say probably in general, the way the Weather Channel does it now is the best option. But I think it could be tinkered with just a little bit to account maybe better for the population characteristics as well.
So we have a question from Twitter here, and this question comes from @shortstack81, and they actually have two questions. Their first question is, why the resistance? and we can all kind of touch on that, because I think there's a lot of reasons for the resistance. And their second question is there any actual indication that they hinder public safety? So that I'm guessing that means, if we're not naming them, is that kind of putting people in unknowingly harm's way, and compared they might know about it if it's named. So the first part, why the resistance? I think we kind of touched on that. The National Weather Service, the Weather Channel kind of difference there, because the National Weather Service would have to take it on for it to be widespread, I think. And I don't know, you have any other comments on that?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's really interesting, and this is kind of similar to hurricanes as well, that a name in the private sector or the insurance sector, a name might be the criteria that triggers somebody's insurance to cover something versus not covering something. So having the government take it over and it being serious is something that would have ramifications and maybe potentially be useful in the private sector as well. And that kind of goes along with like flood warnings and flood zones and things like that for hurricanes. And, only you have to reach a certain threshold or whatnot to get triggered for your flood insurance to count, and you'd be applicable to apply for your reimbursement or whatever for your insurance coverage. So I think that the government essentially taking it over is the most logical way to account for all of that. Yeah. And
so go ahead.
The resistance, just to touch on the resistance thing again, and both inside and outside the community, I think the Weather Channel isn't necessarily always seen with a favorable opinion. I know, especially within the weather community, I mean, we touched upon it a little bit. There are things that the Weather Channel does that can drive a meteorologist up a tree and make them kind of annoyed. I know that there are times when you see things on their homepage or something like that is really an attention-grabbing headline. If 50 million people or 100 million people will be impacted by torrential downpours and things like that, when in reality, maybe a small subset of that group will be impacted by torrential downpours, but that whole group will see a drop of rain or something like that. So, I think it's part of it. Part of the issue is that the Weather Channel were the ones to do it, and it's unfortunate, but it's just it's just the way things are.
Yeah, I think it's kind of unfortunate that the Weather Channel doing it kind of removes the value of actually doing it in a broader sense. I guess the second question is, if we don't name storms, does that do a disservice to the public, not naming winter storms?
I mean, my easy answer is I hope not, because we've been doing it that way for however long now. But at the same sense, that's kind of my whole point, is we really don't know for sure. We can make speculations and make guesses off of what communication strategies we know work in certain situations and how our weather communication has worked in the past and things like that. But the only true way to ever find any of this out is to analyze it and test it and show people tweets or headlines or things like that, or news coverage on television with the name versus without the name, and see what differences emerge. Do people take it more seriously? Do people find more hazard? Do they get more annoyed with the meteorologists if the forecast busts? I mean, there are so many considerations for analyzing this, and we really haven't even, I don't know of any others, to be honest, other than mine, that have really attempted to do this. And you see things in the weather field, like we've analyzed the new storm surge warnings that are, I believe, launching either this year or next year for almost 10 years now, essentially since right after Katrina happened. And I understand it takes a long, long, long time to get these things proven and, fleshed out and make sure that they're going to work and be accepted with the public. But if we're going to do that in one area of our field, we should be doing it in most areas of our field. And it's not like there's a lack of researchers in this area. The weather communication field is growing. You see people studying psychology of weather. Weather is extremely popular on the news and on TV now. It's grouped in with news and social media. So, I mean, essentially, there really is no reason for us not to be able to answer that question, but I just think we haven't made any leaps or bounds into actually analyzing and answering that question.
So we put out a poll on Twitter earlier today, and it got 36 votes, and the question was, straight up, is naming winter storms a good idea? And obviously it was a pretty small amount of people that voted, but 61% said no, and 39% said yes. So I want to put everyone on the spot here for a second. Assuming the National Weather Service takes it over and does it the right way, is naming winter storms a good idea? I say yes. Tyler?
I say yes.
You say yes. Adam?
Yeah, I would probably go with yes as well.
Look at that.
Yeah. I don't know. I see more positives than negatives. Maybe it's not the best strategy, but I think it would, if it was done right, it would serve useful in today's social media, new media environment for sure.
So that's a great place to end, I think. We're all happy and agreeing. Adam, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to have you back soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a great opportunity.
Thank you.
All right, that was Adam Rainear from Yukon, a fellow Connecticut resident right now. We thank him for joining us on the Weather Junkies, and we wish him the best of luck as he pursues his PhD in communication at Yukon. And we're very excited about next week's episode. It is March, and it won't be long before spring begins on the calendar, at least. Meteorological spring has already began, and that means that severe weather season is upon us. So we are going to start to prepare for the severe season by talking about some things that could always use a review. And that could be radar, that could be tornado damage, or assessing radar images, anything that has to do with severe weather. We're going to hone in on a topic and announce a guest and a more precise subject area as we get closer to next week's show, perhaps in the next few days, either this weekend or early next week. Really excited about next week. Hope you'll join us. Dakota, any parting words?
Should be a good show. And I just want to thank Adam again for joining us. And if you don't follow us on Twitter, you can follow us at the WX Junkies. We're also on Facebook. You can listen to us on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, or Stitcher. And if you listen to us on iTunes, if you're listening right now on iTunes, please go ahead and give us a rating and some feedback on the show, whether it's good or bad. We'd love to hear from you. So for Tyler and I, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.